Somewhere out in the Indian Ocean in the 1870s, a Norwegian sailor was struck by a violent fever. But the first mate showed no mercy. He kicked in the door and ordered the sailor to crawl out on the bowsprit to tie a rope. The sailor refused. He was then dragged onto the deck and tied to the mast. His shirt was ripped off, and he was whipped. Eventually, he fainted. When the sailor opened his eyes again, he crawled back to his bunk and grabbed a knife. If he comes back, I'll stab him to death, the sailor thought. Luckily, the first mate never returned, and the sailor recovered. The next day, though, it hit the sailor. I nearly killed the man. And he started to ask himself, what brought me to this edge? The answer was all around him. It wasn't uncommon for sailors to be whipped. Their superiors did it because they could. Sailors had no protection. Years later, the very same sailor would fight to give others the protection he never had himself. And this episode of 200 Norwegians is about Andrew Furuseth, often called the Abraham Lincoln of the sea. Let's play a game. Picture a Norwegian immigrant in America in the 1800s. What do you see? Or more precisely, what do you see around him or her? Take a second. Imagine it. My guess is that you see prairie. Maybe a Norwegian tilling the soil somewhere in the Midwest. Or maybe you see a fisherman in the Pacific Northwest. But California? San Francisco? Probably not. And yet, California has the third largest population of Norwegian Americans in the US, and San Francisco specifically has a rich Norwegian history. There's a Norwegian Seamen's Church there, a Norwegian club, even a Sons of Norway chapter. And the connection between Norway and San Francisco goes way back. Did you, for instance, know that the California state flag, the so-called bear flag, was originally designed by a Norwegian? Or that the Norwegian banker helped found UC Berkeley? Well, now you know. And you should also know that there are statues of Norwegians scattered across the city. One of the statues honors Andrew Furuseth. He was one of many Norwegian seamen who came here in the 1880s. This was before the Panama Canal was built. To get to California, you had to sail around Cape Horn, a brutal route. But Norwegians were no strangers to rough seas, and they came by the thousands. This was during and after the gold rush, when the Wild West was at its wildest. Shanghaiing, the dark art of kidnapping sailors and forcing them onto ships, were common. And yes, some Norwegians were caught up in that underworld. But that's for another episode. This one is about what happened when sailors fought back, when they formed unions and stood up to a system that at times looked a lot like slavery. Which brings me to the old pier, where I meet a man named Gunnar Lundeberg. He shows me where the sailors gathered, where they organized, and where they, after long punishing weeks at sea, finally got to have a little fun.
There were the ships on the other side.
Uh-huh.
Here was the public market. Here was Pacific Avenue. Where all the dancing girls and the booze were.
Gunnar Lundeberg, or Gunnar Lundeberg, is a Norwegian American, a former sailor and a former president of the Sailors' Union of the Pacific. His father, Harry Lundeberg, held the same role. Gunnar tells me San Francisco wasn't just a pit stop for Norwegian sailors. Many ended up staying there. Why? First, because of gold and cheap land, of course, but later, because they could earn more sailing along the coast than crossing oceans. There were so many Scandinavians working these waters that people started calling them the Scandinavian Navy.
Just about all the people that sailed those ships were Scandinavians. And on those ships, you not only sailed the ships, but you worked the cargo.
Right.
You know, they loaded lumber, you know, and particularly, you know, to build a city, you know, going north, I mean, the forest came right down to the sea. So you had all these lumber ports, sawmills. So the sailors loaded that stuff, you know, by hand.
Right.
By hand. One board at a time,
Right.
you know, and they were stacked. So that built the city.
Scandinavians, and Norwegians in particular, also punched above their weight in the Union.
Why were so many of them Norwegian?
Probably better educated. I think better educated. I mean, Furuseth was an educated guy. I mean, he was no slouch.
So where did this well-educated, not slouchy sailor come from? Furuseth was born in 1854, the fifth of 10 children. His birth name was Anders Andreasen Nilsen, but later he took the last name Furuseth, from Furusethstua, a small farm where he spent his early years. He grew up in Romedal, a small place in present-day's county Innlandet, which literally means the inland. Furuseth actually grew up as far away from the sea as you can possibly get in Norway. Håkon Lie, who wrote one of the most detailed books on Furuseth, believed that Furuseth's childhood still very much informed his later Union career. Lie pointed to the fact that Romedal had a sharp class divide. The soil was really fertile and good in this area, so the farms were big and the farm hands many. Furuseth's father was a pond keeper. He managed water levels for timber floating. For that, he got a place to live and about 162 liters of barley every year. That wasn't much for a family of 10. To get by, they fished the river and hunted moose in the woods. But hunting laws at the time banned poor homesteaders like Furuseth's father from hunting, which meant that putting food on the table was a constant struggle. But how tough was it really? Was Norway especially hard on the underprivileged back then? Here is Jonas Bals. Bals is a historian, a labor writer, and an advisor for the Norwegian Confederation of Trade Unions, LO.
With. I think Norway was, even in the 1800s, a more egalitarian society than many other societies, but compared to today, it was a country with sharp class divisions, divisions that were only growing during the 1800s. We had severe health problems for many workers, and we had a huge part of the population that were more or less completely powerless.
But in the 1880s, people increasingly began to question their powerlessness, and a labor movement was beginning to take shape. This was partly inspired by the European revolutions of 1848.
You know, the most famous one of these revolutions were the one in Paris in February, but it was unrest and attempts at revolutions in many European countries. It was unrest here in Norway, it was in Sweden, it was in Denmark, and all over Europe. And the first Norwegian working men's clubs, they were formed directly inspired by the happenings in Europe.
These unions were pushing for better wages, safer working conditions, and political representation.
It started quite modestly in 1848 with the first workers' unions that were not trade unions in a traditional sense. They were more like political clubs. But they grew very fast, and they grew to become one of the, if you compare to the size of the population, they became maybe one of the biggest workers' movements in Europe at the time, with roughly 30,000 members in 1850. The problem was that these clubs were met by very severe repression from the king in Sweden and from the ruling class in Norway. So the leaders of these working men's clubs, they were jailed.
One of the early leaders who ended up in prison was Marcus Trane. He and his followers called for universal male suffrage and access to education, among other things. According to Håkon Lie's book, both Furuseth's father and grandfather were Trane supporters. And even though the movement quickly faded, some of its values were probably instilled in the young Furuseth. But he didn't get to spend too much time with his father and grandfather. At just 8 years old, he was sent away to work on a larger farm. That wasn't super uncommon at the time. Poor boys were often sent to work in exchange for food and a place to sleep. The man who owned the farm, who was also a banker, saw potential in young Furuseth. He helped arrange more schooling than was typical for a boy of Furuseth's background, while his brother just received 15 weeks of school over 3 years. Furuseth went to school for 6 years. Beyond that, little is known about his childhood, except for one story. He once got beaten for taking a cup of water during harvest. At 16, Furuseth faced a choice: stay in the village and become a farmhand, or venture out in the world. He chose the latter. He walked across the frozen surface of Lake Mjøsa to the town of Gjøvik, then made his way to Christiania, now known as Oslo. Over the next few years, he did a number of things. He enrolled in the military's rifle corps, worked in a grocery store outside the city of Tønsberg, and he received more education through family friends in Christiania. He also picked up several languages: English, German, French, and even a bit of Dutch. Now, Furuseth was ready to see the world. But for Furuseth, the world wasn't just the so-called New World across the Atlantic. Unlike his siblings, he didn't want to emigrate to America. He wanted to sail the 7 seas and become a sailor. And he wasn't alone. This was Norway's golden age at sea. Between 6,000 and 7,000 ships flew the Norwegian flag, employing tens of thousands of young men. In 1872, at age 18, Furuseth signed on to the bark Maria in the Norwegian city Drammen. To Furuseth, the sea meant freedom, but he will soon find out it could also feel like a prison.
The ship was a hierarchy, which was a very tough hierarchy. It was a place where you had very little to say if you were not in the top layer of the command chain.
We don't know much about Furuseth's first voyage, but we do know what life at sea was like back then. The food was not the best, to say the least. Sailors typically got half a pound of bread a day, rarely any fresh water, and veggies were almost unheard of. They worked 12 hours a day, every day. The pay was better than on land, but still modest. American ships paid more, so many sailors tried to switch flags. But it wasn't easy. They were bound by contract, and they could only leave their ship in a Norwegian port. So desertions became more and more common, and Furuseth was among those who jumped ship. But changing flags didn't always mean better conditions. Regardless of the flag, captains often held unchecked power, and they could get away with things that would have been criminal on land.
The captain would often have authority as a policeman would have, and it was quite common with uh, punishments. You could be jailed, you could be beaten, and if you resisted, you could be charged for criminal charges. You could be charged for mutiny.
In 1880, a 26-year-old Andrew Furuseth arrived in San Francisco. He came aboard the English vessel Timberland after a long journey from India. He left his backpack and belongings on the ship, so his superior wouldn't suspect that he was indeed deserting. San Francisco back then was the Wild West at its wildest, but also the West Coast at its finest. The city had an opera house, a theater, and even a public library, and Furuseth for sure made the most of it. According to the book Abraham Lincoln of the Sea by Arnold Berwick, Furuseth didn't go to a saloon to get drunk or anything. He went straight to the library and started reading Shakespeare and maritime law. San Francisco at the time was also home to thousands of fellow Scandinavians, and most of them were Norwegians. Many had already begun organizing. Years later, Furuseth said this: I went ashore in San Francisco because I understood this was a city where it might be possible to build a seamen's union that, like a storm, could set sailors free. And that brings us back to Gunnar Lundeberg. Lundeberg and I grabbed a beer in one of the old Barbary Coast saloons. He told me that one reason sailors were so vulnerable was because they had almost no legal protection.
Seamen were, in a particular category. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1863. It didn't, by various court rulings, it didn't include seamen. It included enslaved people, African American people that were held in bondage and everything like that. But if you got off the ship and the problem became so severe, like during the gold rush, like this saloon, this is in the hull of a ship, right? Of people abandoning their ship, the local governing body in San Francisco, the Board of Supervisors, passed an ordinance. Desertion from a ship was a $500 fine. A bounty was put on merchant seamen who quit a ship without the master's permission. So they were hunted down by bounty hunters and brought back to the ship, well, a lot of times in chains.
After arriving in San Francisco, Furuseth worked as a fisherman in the Pacific Northwest. He also sailed on various vessels up and down the West Coast. In Richard Dillon's book, Shanghaiing Days, there's also a story claiming that Furuseth jumped ship in Tacoma, Washington, and that he was hunted down later by men with bloodhounds. The restrictions on sailors' freedom were all over, and boarding house masters, also known as crimps at the time, were often a part of the scheme. Before sailors had the option to stay at sailors' homes, they were often forced to draw their advance wages as a kind of deposit. A trick used by boarding house keepers to keep them in a cycle of debt and control. If a seaman didn't obey the rules, he faced harsh consequences. He could be shanghaied onto a ship against his will, but also beaten or blacklisted. Another story in Dylan's book suggests that Furuseth fell prey to this system personally. When he once left his boarding master in San Francisco, he soon found out he couldn't get work anywhere. Furuseth literally walked up and down the waterfront, and it became increasingly clear that he was blacklisted. In 1885, Furuseth joined the newly formed Sailors' Union of the Pacific. 2 years later, in 1887, he was elected Union Secretary, the highest office and the only paid position in the Union at the time. The Union was in a pretty bad shape at that point. They had just lost a giant battle. 2 years prior, the wages had been slashed by the ship owners, and the Union, with the help of a group of socialist radicals, adopted some so-called guerrilla tactics. They boycotted boarding houses that hired non-union men. They convinced sailors to desert ships paying cut wages. And they set up patrols on the waterfront to check union cards. And they even blocked non-union crews from boarding ships. In response, the ship owners formed an association. They demanded that any sailor who wanted to work on their ships had to give up their union book and carry a new grade book instead. This grade book was a record where captains could rate their service and their obedience. The conflict quickly turned violent. Union men clashed with non-union sailors and police. There were fights on the waterfront, and people were killed. After a failed strike in September of 1886, Union membership plummeted, and the Union was under financial pressure and almost collapsed. But the newly appointed Furuseth was not a man to surrender. He wanted to retaliate, and he had a strategy. The first thing he wanted to do was to get the finances in order, and he managed to do that, and the membership started to rise again. A second thing he wanted to do was to get rid of what he perceived as the radical socialist elements in the Union, which he thought caused division. A third thing he wanted to do was to educate the sailor, so the sailor could fight with his mind as well as with his fists. He went on a speaking tour, and he gave hundreds of talks, all up and down the coast. And he was instrumental in establishing the Union's newspaper, the Coast Seaman's Journal.
It seems like Furuseth invested a lot of time and effort in that journal.
Right, he did.
Why was it so important to him?
Well, it was important, to keep the membership informed of what's going on because, see, the Coast Seaman's Journal was the only labor paper around in California. Everybody read the Coast Seaman's Journal because it had national news, international news. It had, they corresponded with the unions in Europe and everything like that. So, and it was used as a political tool for members of Congress. This is what's going on. One famous run of the Coast Seaman's Journal was a series called the Red Record. Have you heard of that?
Yes.
Okay, the Red Record, and it chronicled all the abuses at sea. Bucko mates, and just all the abuses that seamen were undergoing at the time.
Some of the stories in the Red Record are truly horrifying. One tells of a Norwegian half-wit named Elias Nelson who was beaten to death. There's another story as well about a captain who smashed a bottle over the head of a sailor, so he started to bleed heavily, and then the sailor was tied to the spanker boom and just left there for hours. Furuseth didn't just record these stories, he also made sure that the stories were read by the important people in Washington.
And it was delivered to the Congress at some point, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. Well, that was the basis, like, for the Maguire Act, then the White Act, then ultimately the Seamen's Act, 1915.
What was the Maguire Act?
The Maguire Act was a precursor of the Seamen's Act. Basically, it was the same thing: decent food, decent pay, conditions, the watch system. Instead of having, 2 watches, port and starboard, as it had been for an eternity all over the world, to have a 3-watch system.
The Maguire Act, at least on paper, also put an end to the practice of jailing sailors who deserted coastal ships. But Lundeberg and I are jumping the gun a bit here. There was no straight path from the founding of the Seamen's Journal to the Maguire Act. By the time that law became a reality, 9 years had passed, and a lot had happened in between, including some major setbacks. Furuseth had also quit the union several times, as he believed the union needed new leadership, but every time he was asked to come back. First, because his successor had stolen from the union's treasury. Later, because the union simply needed a man of his standing back in charge. Honest Andy, as he came to be called, was a man with integrity that people could trust and also would listen to. He merged the Coal Seamen's Union with the Steamship Sailors' Union, and in 1893 he took on the shipowners again. This time around, they were also hiring sailors below union wages, and once again they used crimps to do the dirty work. The union therefore pulled the sailors from the city's boarding houses and sent them to live in the countryside, on the union's dime. This was a hard-hitting strategy, but also a costly one. And in the end, the union couldn't afford to keep going, and it had to accept lower wages. Later that year, a bomb also exploded outside a well-known crimps boarding house. 6 sailors were killed. Furuseth denied any union involvement, but many believed that the union was to blame. Even so, Furuseth kept fighting, also politically. The Sailors' Union of the Pacific was about to become a serious voting bloc in San Francisco, and they gained a powerful ally, Congressman James Maguire. The union endorsed him, and he backed their causes. Maguire took the union's demands and split them into 6 separate bills, and introduced them to Congress. Furuseth also testified before a House committee, and eventually the Maguire Act became law. But just because the law changed on paper, it didn't mean that the life of the sailors changed overnight.
But see, the Maguire Act passed, and as soon as something passed in the Congress that was beneficial for seamen, it was immediately attacked by ship owners. They found loopholes and how to get around this and how to get around that. And so the Maguire Act kind of fell apart with this famous case about the sailing ship called the Argo. So the ship sailed from here, went up to the Columbia River, and then was going to go to Chile. So 4 sailors that had shipped here and who were members of the Sailors' Union said, we don't want to go. So they got off the ship in the state of Washington. Well, they were labeled as deserters. All right. Even with the passage of the Wagner Act. So the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which freed the slaves, did not apply to merchant seamen. So these guys were caught brought back on board the ship in chains and said, "You will sail this ship." Yeah. So a couple of years later, Senator White from California. See, Maguire was the congressman from San Francisco. So White, I forget his first name, he introduced the same legislation as Maguire in the Senate. It passed, but it still had a lot of loopholes in it. So Furuseth spent the next 20 years of his life going back and forth to Washington to get this passed, you know.
There are many stories about how Andrew Furuseth earned his stripes in Washington. At his first congressional hearing, he showed up in an old suit, which was quote unquote sailor pressed, meaning it had been flattened overnight between his mattress and bedboard. He didn't come across as disrespectful though, just humble. He was well prepared, he knew maritime law better than anyone, and he quoted the Bible. He appealed to lawmakers' conscience and their humanity. He didn't think the laws existed purely because of evil. He thought it was also because they simply didn't know what was going on. According to observers, his speech was so passionate that it was impossible to ignore. At some of the hearings, representatives from the shipping industry made shocking claims about sailors. Vernon C. Brown, president of the Maritime Exchange of New York, described sailors as driftwood from their native country. Men, he said, who couldn't get jobs at home. He even claimed that their average intelligence was very low. But Furuseth didn't need to fire back. The sailor with the thick Norwegian accent and the eloquent and intelligent way of talking embodied the rebuttal. In December 1909, Senator Robert La Follette met Furuseth for the first time. He later described Furuseth as a tall man with eyes full of purpose. "I want to be free," Furuseth told him. "Everyone else is, except the sailor." La Follette invited Furuseth to breakfast that Sunday, and nearly every Sunday after. Those breakfasts became their war room, where the fight for the Seamen's Act truly began.
Yeah, he found an ally in La Follette. And this was the era, in the 1910, in that era, where progressivism was on the rise in the United States, with Teddy Roosevelt and, and other people, and also the rise, of labor.
In 1910, a group of reform-minded Republicans and reform-minded Democrats held majority in Congress, and many were receptive to Furuseth's ideas that weren't just rooted in humanitarian concerns. Furuseth also argued that improving sailors' rights would also make American merchant fleet more competitive. Better conditions, after all, would attract more talent, which would give more high-quality crews and more reliable labor. La Follette later presented it in the Senate, but not much happened. Ironically, real momentum didn't come until after the Titanic sank. The tragedy opened the public's eye to the dangers at sea and helped push maritime safety and sailors' rights. The Seamen's Act was signed into law on March 4th, 1915.
The Seamen's Act regulated working hours, so you could only work so many hours instead of at the mercy of the ship owner or the captain. Regulated wages, regulated food, how much food, down to how much you should get. An interesting thing on the food is, in the from the 1850s until about 1890, I mean, most of the scurvy in the world was on American flag ships. It wasn't like the British who put, lots of lemons and limes around, or everybody else. But American seamen had the highest rates of scurvy in the world. So included in the food is so much citrus, how much produce we have. The other thing was how many able seamen are on the ship. A minimum amount, determined by the ship and the rig. And one of the primary things was that everybody speaks the same language. Everybody has to speak English, period. Now, he was helped in that endeavor by the fact that in 1901, a ship a steamship called the Rio de Janeiro sank coming in the Golden Gate. It came in the dense fog, but she sank. She hit rocks. And a tremendous loss of life. One reason was nobody could understand each other.
Furuseth was often accused of spending too much time in DC, but he believed that the local fight was also a national fight. And the labor movement also gained momentum in San Francisco specifically. Union membership surged, and in 1901, Andrew Furuseth brought together dock workers, transport workers, and sailors under one umbrella. A sympathy strike followed, and ended with employers recognizing the union as a negotiating partner. This was a major win for Furuseth. 5 years later, in 1906, the union fought for a $5 monthly raise. After a 5-month-long strike, the ship owners gave in. So the union was thriving, but with growth came diversity and division. Different fractions pulled in different directions. In San Francisco alone, you had socialist union members, anarchist union members, and some so-called wobblies, to name a few. According to historian Jonas Bals, this wasn't unique to San Francisco though.
I think it's correct to say that after around 1900, these divisions, they grew stronger because it was questions regarding ideological questions were suddenly very real tactical divisions of whether to run for elections or not, whether to pursue a strategy of gradual reform or more revolutionary programs.
Furuseth was a reformer, and throughout his career, he feared that the Union could be taken over by revolutionaries, especially the socialists, and later communist revolutionaries. That fear wasn't just paranoia. There was a pragmatic side to it. He believed that if a union leaned too far left, it would divide people, and the banner had to be broad so all seamen could walk under it. But it wasn't just the strategy, I think. He was also personally suspicious of socialists and communists. Later in life, in the 1920s, he said that work was a form of worship, and that the Marxists were trying to avoid labor, which he called unchristian. So what were Furuseth's politics? Was he just a liberal who believed all people were created equal and should be treated as such? But beyond that, was he almost apolitical? Some have called him a conservative labor leader, but I don't think that label really fits. Yes, he read the Bible all his life, and yes, he valued personal responsibility, a value often coupled with conservatism in America in recent decades. But throughout his career, he didn't fight to conserve the system. He fought to change it, and he often spoke about solidarity and shared struggle in a way that almost sounded socialist. So what was he? And does it really matter? I think I'm looking for something here because Furuseth worked so hard and so selflessly for so many years. He must have had some kind of strong conviction, right? I think he had, but I don't think it necessarily was partisan. One of the thinkers who inspired him was the Scottish philosopher Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle believed in the heroic individual, someone who would act with courage, discipline, and integrity, no matter their circumstances. Furuseth believed much the same. He often said that the sailor had to do his duty at sea and carry himself with dignity on land, not just to stand up to the ship owners, but for his own self-respect as well. And Furuseth lived as he preached.
Where did he live? Can you just point in
I
the
think
right direction?
Stewart Street, which is that way,
That's where he
a
lived.
few blocks away. Yeah. I'm sure that the place where he lived is long gone, but
He had a pretty modest lifestyle.
oh yeah.
What have you been told about that?
Yeah. You know, he was like, his thing was justice for seamen. That was it. You know,
Right.
he wasn't a drinker or a smoker or a womanizer or anything like that.
He just read books and worked, huh?
Worked. Yeah.
Throughout his entire career, Furuseth lived in small and humble apartments. He never accumulated any wealth, and the little money he had, he gave to relatives and to the union. He never accepted a higher salary than that of an ordinary seaman. People begged him to run for office, told him he could earn 10 times what he made, but he always said no. Unlike many labor leaders of his time, he never took bribes from ship owners. That made him respected and hated, but more than anything, very efficient in his role. After the Seamen's Act, he had one final dream: to unite all sailors from all nations. It was a pragmatic idea. Ships crossed borders. Flags changed, but the work and the workers remained pretty much the same. He believed they needed a kind of global solidarity. He once said, "When the world's seamen are organized, tyranny, hunger, and brutality will be a thing of the past." He attended international congresses to spread this vision, but it wasn't easy. Not everyone was ready to follow.
You know, he went to the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919. You know, and that his goal was for this to be the Seamen's Act to be the law all over the world. Well, he ran into all kinds of opposition. I mean, for us, for Americans, you know, it's a bedrock, you know, for seamen's rights. In the rest of the world, it just fell apart. So there was a law on the books. You have to treat seamen so much, you have to pay them so much, you have to, you know, then, you know, collective bargaining comes in. And so ship owners said, oh, fuck that. And they started to flag their ships out. First, it started here, Panama.
Right.
You know, and the rise of the flags of convenience. All that started in the United States. You know,
After our walk through the city, Lundeberg and I end up on Rincon Hill, where the Sailors' Union of the Pacific still stands. By the entrance, there's a statue of Harry Lundeberg, Gunnar's father, and across from it, a statue of Andrew Furuseth.
you can put me in jail, but you cannot give me narrower quarters than I had then as a seaman. I've always had. You cannot give me coarser food than I've always eaten. You cannot make me lonelier than I've always been. Oh my God! Every time I read that, it just. I think he said that before Congress.
So we're standing here,
And that statue was the sculptor did that from real life. It's not from a picture, so you know he was a scary looking guy.
And it looks pretty scary.
Yeah.
That's a little bit of an ego.
Tough.
Yeah. He has like an ego nose, I would say, right?
Yeah, he was one tough guy.
Right.
You had to be tough on this waterfront.
So, what is the legacy of Furuseth today?
The legacy of Furuseth today is this union. You know. Now his legacy, you know, as far as seamen across the world, you know, has been diluted because his dream for, you know, to lift everybody up, you know, was dashed, you know, but by unions in other countries, but mainly like the ship owners.
Furuseth, in many ways, was a real hero, but there's something I haven't mentioned. In May 1905, Furuseth helped found the Asiatic Exclusion League. Its mission was to stop immigration from Asia. But it didn't stop there. The League also targeted Asian communities already living in the US. One of its early campaigns pressured the San Francisco Board of Education to exclude Japanese and Korean children from public schools.
So, during his time, Andrew Furuseth supports the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Right.
What do you make of that?
Well, you know, you have to look at it at that time.
Right.
You know, not, you know, from, you know, 21st century values. As I mentioned to you before, the ship owners are always looking at the cheapest labor. So there was no requirement on ships that sailed in the offshore trades, you know, international trades, to use American seamen. There was no requirement. That didn't really come until 1936 in this country. So what the ship owners would do, they'd employ Chinese. So he was part of his times. And, you know, it was like railed against the Chinese, you know, taking our jobs, you know. So.
But isn't that a little bit? It's pretty easy to say, like, it was a different time and all of that.
Well, it is. But you know that in San Francisco, like, was rapidly anti-Chinese. I mean, that Chinese Exclusion Act started here. Right. You know, the genesis of it was here. And so once again, you know.
But isn't it a little bit hard to reconcile as well, because he was very like egalitarian minded, and it seems to me that he actually fought for like the black sailors and the Hispanic sailors.
Yeah. I mean, we have people from all over the world here. You know.
Do you think in this day and age where, you know, there are all these purity tests, you know,
right?
Do you think this statue will stand here for another 100 years?
Well, see, that's always like a worry. You know, they tore down statues of, you know, of all kinds of people. And so when that stuff was happening around here, I told my successor, I said, watch these statues. Yeah. Because it's easy to say, oh, Andrew Furuseth, and I thought they're racist, this and that. Oh, my God. You know, using 21st century values.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
If Furuseth were sitting up in heaven and saw someone tear down his statue, he might not have cared that much, though. He never sought personal glory. In fact, he probably would have hated the idea of a statue in his honor. He didn't even want a grave, just his ashes scattered at sea, which, by the way, happened after he passed away in 1938. After he was cremated, his ashes were placed in an urn and brought aboard a merchant ship. When the vessel reached the middle of the Atlantic, as far from land as possible, his ashes were scattered to the sea. But Furuseth's legacy didn't vanish with the waves. It lives on today, according to historian Jonas Bals. How did he change America?
I think it's fair to say that this piece of legislation from 1915 was extremely important, not only for sailors in the US, but also for sailors internationally. And I think even if it's an expression of his rhetorical hyperbole, I think he was correct when he said that with this ending of the existing seamen's legislation, they also got rid of the last bondage existing under the American flag. So it was a huge step forward for sailors. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember that history is not like a straight arrow going in one direction. A lot of the victories that he won or was part of winning, together with many other workers, of course, many of them were retracted later. And he experienced a lot of defeats. But he was a man of a strong will, and he was very good at mobilizing people. Also in meeting defeats, he would always remind people that there's no reason to give up. One setback doesn't mean that you have lost. It just means that you have to find another way to fight. So even if Andrew Furuseth had some problematic sides to him, and we have touched upon several of them in this conversation, I think it's also correct to say that his legacy is one to be proud of, and he was in many ways a pioneer. That was very important not only for the American labor movement, but also for the European and the Norwegian labor movement.
My name is Fredrik Halstveit, and this episode was made in conjunction with Vestre Museum and with the support of Norway House Foundation out of San Francisco. The music you hear in the background was made by Jan Skoglund. And in the next episode, you will learn about the Norwegian serial killer Bell Gunnes.